Thank you so much for having me. This is so exciting. About 10 years ago, I came to my first Nerd Night, courtesy of Lewis himself. And I had just moved here, didn't know anybody, didn't have any friends, and then I got invited to a room full of nerds, and it was awesome. So I'm so excited to be giving a talk now that I know stuff, which I didn't at 23 or however old I was then. Um, all right, so getting my bearings here. My name's Andie. I'm going to talk to you about soil microbes today. So, soil microbes, we want them living in your compost, we want them living in the soil. We're going to talk about all of the nitty gritty details and try to bring it back to some practical takeaways for you as you go home and tend to your garden or a compost of your own, or even just looking at urban green spaces a little bit differently after leaving here. So here I am doing my work. I am a microscopist. I am a compost maker. I am a science communicator. And my intention is to bridge the gap between research and people that are actually dealing with soil. So whether you rely on them for your livelihood, like a farmer, or you're just trying to keep a nice lawn, I have found my role to be in bridging that gap between what research scientists know and applying it in the field. My background is in plant science research, and I got a glimpse into that long-term career path. Thought it was fascinating, but not for me. So I find comfort in being the bridge. And the two ways that I try to do that is through my business. My business here, I'm going to turn so you can still hear me. My business is Rhizos LLC. It's a small business. It's a new thing, relatively. So what people do with my business is they send me soil samples or compost samples, and I evaluate them with the microscope. I tell them what is or is not living in there and help them restore their soils from the ground up. The other way that I try to bridge that gap for people is through my Substack, which is called Soil is Sexy. And we're going to talk about all of the reasons that soil is sexy. So this is a new thing as well. I'm just trying to provide information to people that might not be the best fit for my microscopy services, but are interested in learning about things like biochar or how to make a better compost. And I talk about the history of fertilizers. Sometimes I'll have an essay that has a more philosophical bent, like talking about the relationship between humans and land systems, talking about how we can feel native to a place in a modern context. I think this is a huge part of how we're going to restore soils, is being in relationship with land. All right, so why is soil sexy? Backing up here. So when I think of soils, my obsession really stems from the fact that so many things in our daily lives can be traced back to soil. For instance, most obvious, food. So whether that food is plant-based or animal-based, the nutrients in it ultimately came from the soil. Another thing is clothing. So cotton, wool, bamboo type clothing, all those things came from the soil ultimately. Something that you might not think of immediately would be building materials. So whether that's like mineral-based brick and mortar or timber, right? Timber came from trees that were grown in the soil. So this, to me, is why soil is sexy. It's a common thread, and it's not totally obvious at first, but when you start thinking about how much soil really impacts our lives and is a resource to us, you can get a little obsessed. So that was kind of my poetic version of why soil is sexy, but for those of you who need a checklist, I have one for you. And ecosystem services would be like the technical term for, you know, what benefits does healthy soil provide to humans. And I emphasize healthy soils. The way I would define a healthy soil is a soil with a functional food web. And we're going to get more into that here in a second. So healthy soil systems provide the benefits of nutrient cycling, decomposition. Can you imagine a world in which nothing ever degraded? That would be wild. It would be pretty gross too. Carbon cycling and storage, right? So ever the trending topic, extra important when we have a carbon imbalance in the atmosphere. And then soil structure, this one really gets me going. Soil structure, as a soil scientist, when I think of soil structure, I think of aggregates. And aggregates are awesome. Aggregates are formed by microbes, and it creates a sponge-like consistency in the soil. So that means water can actually be absorbed into the soil, and it can be retained in the soil. Meaning that we, especially here in Texas, when it rains, it pours. We want to be able to actually absorb that water and then retain it for that inevitable drought season that we all dread. So drought tolerance, fire mitigation actually, and flood mitigation are the kinds of services that I'm talking about when we improve the health of our soils. All right, so when we want to think about soil, the health of a soil ecosystem, it's useful to first think of an above ground ecosystem and how that works. So what I see when I look at a food web diagram is there's a transfer of energy happening at every stage. So you have these prey species in these lower trophic levels, and as, say, this grasshopper is ingested by this bird, there's a transfer of energy. All of those molecules that were in that grasshopper are going to be transferred in some way and to fuel this bird. And then as that bird becomes lunch for the hawk, the same thing happens there. So there's a transfer of energy happening in these predator-prey relationships. And what a lot of people don't realize is this dynamic occurs below ground as well. So enter soil food web. How many of you have seen this diagram? Any? All right. We got a few nerds over the front. They're all at the front. I love that. Okay, so in this context, the prey in the soil is mostly bacteria and fungi. And there are groups of organisms that will predate on them, right? Prey on them. So protozoa is a group of organisms that are predators of bacteria. Nematodes, some of them feed on bacteria, some of them specialize in feeding in fungi. So this is the basic dynamics. And now here's the problem. When I look at soils for clients or whoever, a lot of the soils come from cultivated landscapes, urban green spaces. They run a gamut. I have clients that are local nonprofit farms all the way to the Dallas Cowboys practice field. Like, I look at soils from many different contexts, and a lot of them only have bacteria. There's no biodiversity. And why is that? Like, we don't even have diversity among the prey. Like, there's very little fungi in a lot of cases. And when you have, no predators to prey on that bacteria, that really disrupts all of those benefits I was mentioning. It really stunts nutrient cycling, and it allows the prey species to grow uncontrollably. So that's the bad news, but there is good news to come. Here, we're going to describe why this is happening. So the main reason that we'll find a lack of biodiversity, a lack of predators in disrupted soil systems is because of disturbances. That's just it. They're disrupted. So common disturbances are listed up here. And I would just ask you, think like a microbe for a second. Would you like your home to be tilled up a couple times a year, or stomped on daily, or left exposed to the scorching sun or wind or rain? The answer is probably no. And that's what's happening. We're just inadvertently killing them through a lot of poor management practices. So another thing that kind of hones this in is this concept of ecological succession. So you might recognize this type of depiction from like a 7th grade ecology class, where the concept is that you have this barren ground that the first plant species that are going to grow on that in that environment are going to be low growing bryophytes like mosses. And as they die back, they produce the organic matter and build the topsoil to then support the next successional stage of plants, which tend to be weedy species. So things with like a deep taproot, or even still low growing, but maybe they're fixing more nitrogen. So that's where we tend to see a lot of legumes growing, is in these early succession stages. And then that will again set the stage for a higher level of plants to be able to be successful on that site, and so on and so forth, until in theory you have this climax community of a diverse forest. So this is just a concept. It kind of helps you think about our landscapes in a new way. And so when I shared that we only have bacteria in a lot of these samples, this here is research done by Dr. Elaine Ingham, which is where I did a lot of my training through. And to put the bacterial dominance on this illustration, I'm seeing high bacteria levels in here, and I rarely see anything, to have a lot of fungi. What's interesting about this is that we've understood ecological succession from above ground plants because it's very visible. So like we've known that as a concept for a really long time, but what's new about this information is that there's ecological succession happening below ground as well. So what's cool about that is that means we could maybe influence these landscapes by informing the root zone of what organisms we want growing there and protecting those organisms, and then allowing them to just be in relationship with the plants that we're trying to grow. This is a quote from one of my Substack newsletters, and it really just summarizes what I'm saying here, which is that we're constantly disturbing the soil. So the soil microbiome is stuck in an early succession stage, all while we're trying to grow mid to late succession plants. So once you start to understand this, it kind of changes your approach and your perspective of what's going on. Now I can read an above ground landscape and pretty much know what's happening below ground before ever getting that sample on a microscope. Okay, so now for some fun stuff. I'm gonna show you the critters that I get to look at every day. So these are nematodes. These are beneficial bacterial feeding nematodes. If you look up at this mouth here, he's slurping up bacteria. The bacteria, by the way, are all of these vibrating specks, these little round cocci bacteria, and this one's wiggling for us. This is a nematode inside an egg. So if you pay attention closely, it's actually kind of moving inside of there. So when I went to Texas A&M and, oh, whoop, all right. I know it's always scary in Austin being like, yeah. I'm respectful, Austin's great because, yeah, I just don't like to admit that I'm an Aggie sometimes. But no, it was a great experience, and I had a pretty multidisciplinary experience there. But I will say, it being a big ag school, they didn't talk much about beneficial nematodes. They only warned us about root-feeding nematodes. And so that tends to make one scared and prescribe things like pesticides, which just kind of kill everything and not like the exact thing that you want it to kill. So I've learned a lot outside of school through experience, good and bad. Oh, this is a good group. This is a good blob. Everyone loves a good blob. So naked amoebae. It is sexy, I told you. We have two naked amoebae here. And if you look closely, there's a little vacuole, kind of this empty looking circle in each one of them. This one's a little bit tinier. And what that amoeba is doing is it's taking in, I got photobombed by a nematode there. So we have bacteria inside these amoeba, and they're basically taking those nutrients that they need, and then whatever they don't need, they put into that vacuole, and then eventually that vacuole will flush itself out and release that byproduct into the rhizosphere, the root zone. And what's really cool about that is that that byproduct is literally plant available nutrients. This is how plants grew for millennia before the advent of fertilizers, right? They have a system in place with microbes in the soil to get the nutrients they need. But the microbes have to be there. Oh, this one's pretty cool. So a lot of people, when I say amoeba, they think of the blobs, which are fun. But there's a lot of amoebae that will live in a test, like a shell, to protect themselves. And this is a rare shot of one coming out of its shell under the microscope. So it's feeding, and you can see these tendrils coming out and occasionally pulling back bacteria into its mouth, or whatever you want to call it. This looks like the tail end of maybe a nematode that's taking a nap. There's organic matter all throughout this sample. So these are the things that I look for in healthy soil samples. Oh, this is a real showstopper. It just keeps getting better, you guys. So, okay, this is a flagellate. Both of these are flagellates, okay? This is the coolest thing I've probably seen on the microscope, this flagellate that's like morphing into different shapes. Like it originally kind of looks like a mushroom shape, and it has this nice long flagellum that's pulling itself through the soil media, and it'll just keep doing crazy things. And then meanwhile, we have your average flagellate. You know, I kind of think of this as like this is a supermodel. Like everyone wants to be this flagellate, but most of us are just, you know, hardworking, providing for our families, average dad bod. You know, we can't all be the morphing flagellate, but there you have it. Okay, so less exciting but still sexy, if you ask me, is fungi. So fungi, you might think of a mushroom. That, of course, is the reproductive organ of a fungi. But the body of it is in the mycelium that's below ground, which you can't typically see, right? What we're looking at on the microscope at 400 times magnification is going to be hyphae. So mycelium, for all the fungi nerds here, I kind of think of as like a cable with a bunch of wires in it. I'm not an electrician, so I don't really know if this is going to track, but you can think of mycelium as a cable, and the hyphae are what make up the wires inside. So the hyphae is like the most microscopic thing that we could look at. In theory, you could maybe see mycelium with the naked eye, like in your compost or rotting in some mulch somewhere. So what's cool about fungi when I look at these photos is this is really why fungi is the carbon storing superhero that it is. These rigid cell walls and the septate, like all of that requires structure, which comes from carbon-based molecules. So you can imagine that high surface area in the soil could store a lot of carbon if the fungi were there and if the fungi were undisturbed. So that's why when we till, the fungi actually break apart and die, and then the carbon is like released into the atmosphere, which is the opposite way we want the carbon going. But if we're able to encourage fungal growth and protect fungal growth, the carbon will continue going in a net direction that we want it, which is underground. Okay, so to really hone this in, here's a side-by-side example of what I would call dirt, dysfunctional soil, and functional soil. And so some things to note here is that on the left-hand side, I've diluted this about 4 times as much as this sample. And look at all those bacteria. Now that all of you know how to identify bacteria, love it, that's a lot of bacteria. And this side has relatively little. And you also see a lot of biodiversity. So we had the nematode. This is a testate amoeba. We saw some fungal spores and little branches of fungal hyphae throughout there, where on this side, all we saw was bacteria. Okay, so we're gonna switch gears to compost, and then we're gonna come back around to that bacteria dominance idea before wrapping up. Compost, what do you think of, first of all, when I say compost, what do you think of? You can silently think of it to yourself, or you can shout it out. Food scraps. Okay, you think of food scraps. What else? Yard waste. I heard something that started with a P. Poop. Poop. Okay. Okay, I love it. Okay, so yeah, these are 3 different pictures to represent what anyone might think of when you hear the word compost. This is problematic, okay, because these are 3 very different things. You have food scraps, called compost. You have actively composting compost. And then you have finished compost. It's a soil amendment at that stage. So here's a sentence using compost in all its ill-defined meaning. Are you ready? I took my compost to the compost and composted it to make compost. It's nonsensical. So I share this, and here's another example to really hone this in. If I had a picture up here of eggs and flour, batter, and a finished cake, and I said, I took cake and made it a cake and then baked it into a cake. It's just nonsensical. And worse yet, it's kind of like if you half-baked your cake and turned it into a cake, and you still called it cake and sold it to people. It should be a crime. You know what I mean? It's not finished. It's not finished compost. I'm getting a little fired up. So hold on. Let me. we'll get to the real takeaway, but I will spare you my rage. This didn't work out, but you kind of get the idea. So we're gonna look at another side by side. So average compost that like you'd get from a soil yard or Home Depot or whatever, and this isn't gonna be every compost, but most compost that you would go out and purchase is gonna look like this. Does it look familiar? Yes, it looks like bacterial dominant dirt. And this over here has fungi, it has fungal spores, it has far less bacteria in it. You have a testate amoeba down here. I think I saw a flagellate bumbling around. Lots of aggregation. So compost has a similar story as our soils. And this statement here kind of summarizes that. Why are we applying bacteria dominant compost that has low biodiversity onto disturbed soils that are suffering from that very thing? Once you know this, you can't unsee it. So you will be composting differently and buying compost differently, and that is my greatest hope for you all here today. So there's not a great way to summarize this. I think this slide is kind of where my mind like exploded and like a lot of words got written up there. But I just kind of want to say that lack of vocabulary is, you know, of what to call compost, or what to call all of those various things that are part of the composting process. That to me reflects where we're at in our mainstream awareness of soil health and how to improve it. So it's concerning because one, we need to be doing something about soil health, and we need to be doing it now because it's part of the climate problem. And we don't even have the language to have meaningful conversation about it. So there are some terms that my colleagues and I use to try to differentiate like bad compost from excellent biodiverse compost. I share a lot of that on my Substack if you're interested. We basically just call it GOM, ground up organic matter, because that's what it is. So that's ultimately why we have that problem with compost when you buy it from a large industrial maker, is that they have a waste management business model. So they're doing a good thing by taking, you know, food waste and yard waste and quickly degrading it and then turning it into something that kind of looks like soil and selling it. They don't even know about fungi and protozoa. Like they don't know, and they probably don't care, but they could care if they did know. And so that's where I think that it's on the consumer to start having higher standards for what they're looking for in a compost. So being able to call a soil yard and be like, what's your fungi to bacteria ratio? Show me your microbiome results. Like anything to kind of be asking the question of them of like what lives in your compost, so that they know people care about that, and then they can start doing things a little bit differently. And what's exciting is that to me, it feels like low-hanging fruit to take a soil yard that is doing this good thing of diverting waste from going to the landfill. The only thing they need to be doing differently is like monitoring for biology and dialing in their feedstocks and their rate of maturation and their quality control around what's living in there before selling it. Because otherwise, we just have a lot of bacteria that we throw on top of more bacteria, and we keep this bad cycle going. So to give you some actionable places that you can go find excellent compost locally, I would highly recommend Brothers Worm Farm out of Kyle, Texas. And then there's another guy I met recently at a conference called Fungi Compost. And he makes compost using Johnson Sioux bioreactors. It's a very fancy, it's not a spaceship. It's a compost cylinder, and it's very low maintenance. So I also recommend it as a DIY method. And then Worm Farm, of course, is vermicompost. So I didn't realize it till just now, but those are the two methods I would recommend for at-home composting, because one, they're pretty low maintenance and accessible, and they also tend to yield really excellent compost. There are lots of tips to give to do that right, because you can make a really bad vermicompost and you can make a really bad Johnson Sioux compost. But again, that's what I do. So that's the career I have ahead of me, is helping people understand what compost is, what compost isn't, and start to use different terminology to have deeper conversations about this. So thank you for your time, and I'm open for questions.
Okay, how's my mic working? Can we get a little more volume on this mic? I think we need more volume, right? Okay, hands are already coming up. Awesome. I'm gonna walk this wireless mic around the room, and you're first.
How would you recommend to treat your compost to make it less bacteria rich and add the other more upper trophic levels of the food web?
You're asking what I recommend you add to an existing compost?
How would you introduce that?
Yeah, how would you introduce it? So it mostly has to do with feedstocks and timing. So that's the advice that I would have for anyone who's making compost, whether you're doing it at a small scale like backyard compost, or even under your sink compost, or at an industrial scale. So feedstocks are what's going into the compost to make it up. So that would be like woody materials and green materials, and getting that ratio appropriate for your method. With these two that I mentioned, these are not hot composting methods, and that's what I like about them, is the Johnson Sioux, you would literally get carbon-based materials. So it could be filled entirely with wood chips or brown leaves, or a mixture of both. And fungi love that stuff, and the bacteria will be there, and they'll support some amount of predator organisms. But what you're doing with the Johnson Sioux is you're kind of incubating fungi. And so that's what I really love about that one, since so many of our soils are deficient in fungi. Creating a compost that's entirely made of fungal foods is like a good way to go about it. And then when it comes to vermicompost, you can kind of do something similar, where you're just lightly feeding fungal foods. So every time you add like food scraps or whatever to your worm bin, like follow it with a little sprinkling of oatmeal, like something that the fungi will feed on, and you'll end up with a much more balanced microbiome.
Cool. All right, next.
I have a question about tilling. I don't know much about cultivation or farming, but you say that tilling is one way that the fungi gets disrupted and the carbon is all released. So one, why do they do it? What is the need for that? And two, what will be an alternative for that?
Yeah, that's a big question, and I do have like a whole article on this one topic. The spark notes would be one, first of all, don't demonize anyone who's tilling. I don't want that to be the take-home message, right? Tilling is just as much a cultural thing as it is a cultivation method. So knowing the history of tilling is helpful and understanding why we do it. There is evidence that you get a boost of nutrients to young seedlings after you till, and that's because you're killing a lot of organisms, and then there's like a bacterial bloom, and that makes a lot of nutrients become available to that seedling. But long term, you're ruining the fertility of the soil. There are some really practical reasons people till outside of that too, and that would be clearing the land of weeds so that the new seedlings don't have as much competition for sunlight. So there are really practical reasons that we do tilling. And I also am not like a strictly no-till, never. There is definitely certain contexts that would merit a tillage. But the thing is, we just want to be cognizant of what we're doing when we till. And if we acknowledge that we're disrupting the microbiome, what are we doing to counteract that disruption? Maybe you can come in with an inoculant, whether that's like a compost extract in a liquid form or a biodiverse top dressing and mulching. What really successful no-till farmers do is a mixture of cover cropping, mulching. They're always keeping a living root of some plant, desired plant, in place so that weeds won't crop up. And they're following all 6 soil health principles, which really focus on protecting the soil. Yeah, good question.
Okay. Lots of questions. All right, we're just going to go in order down the tables.
So I saw in one of your slides you had like an ammonium and nitrate balance. I know a lot of, especially larger agricultural producers and in the no-till space, are doing anhydrous ammonia. What kind of an impact does that kind of a soil a fertilization scheme have versus traditional nitrate fertilizers?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so this is a fertilizer-specific question. So the reason that we're applying nitrogen in any form, whether it's the ammonium or a nitrate form, is because that nutrient cycling isn't happening, right? So we would see deficiencies in the plants if we don't either restore the soil food web to get that nutrient cycling occurring, or providing it ourselves. It kind of puts the onus on us when we disrupt that plant microbe relationship. Now we have a plant-human relationship. And so that's where fertilizers come in. And the difference between the two types of nitrogen sources that you mentioned, the way that I view it is if a plant is responding better to nitrate compared to ammonium, that means it's probably an earlier succession plant. But if it's responding more to ammonium, it's probably considered a mid to late succession plant. So that's why a lot of farmers actually use a little bit of both. Because there are a lot of plants that need both. The mid-succession plants need like a 1-to-1 ratio of fungi to bacteria. And I bring up fungi to bacteria. You sound particularly interested, so I'll go there. But if there's a more fungal dominant soil, there's more ammonium becoming available in that system, where more bacteria rich is going to be nitrate is available. Yeah.
Hi. First, thank you for doing this. This has been a very entertaining and informative lecture.
Yay.
And I just wanted to know, you mentioned that biodiversity in soil does have an impact on climate change. Is that 100% because of the carbon capture from fungi, or are there other elements to that?
Yeah, it's definitely like a complex number of reasons that all kind of converge in the soil. And so the way I think about carbon is that it's constantly moving from organisms to CO2 to back into organisms, and then it could be in a mineral form, and like it gets around, you know? And what we want is for the soil to be a common stop in the carbon cycle. So that could be allowing that carbon to come in. They call it like the liquid carbon pathway, where like plants are photosynthesizing, so they're taking atmospheric CO2 and then putting it into their bodies. And a lot of it, up to 80%, it turns out, is actually being exuded into the soil to attract these microbes and feed them. And so then that carbon becomes embodied in those microbes, and then they're preying on each other. And so carbon is constantly cycling. If you have a greater biomass of organisms in the soil, more carbon is there. Where like when you have less diversity or just less organisms in general, that means there's just carbon probably more in the atmosphere at that point. I don't know if that answered your question. Yeah.
Okay, who's next?
Hi, thanks again for the talk, that was wonderful.
Yeah.
I had a question about disturbance. So one thing that I've become aware of recently is the importance of disturbance in ecosystems. So for example, in maintaining grasslands through
Fire
is the classic. The other one is large herbivore action,
Grazing,
which
yeah.
has been kind of removed from a lot of landscapes.
Mm-hmm.
I'm from England, and we've extirpated them all in England, unfortunately. That doesn't seem to line up terribly well with what you were saying before about tilling.
Yeah.
Because one of the actions of large herbivores is they chew up the ground, they
Yeah.
destroy a lot of stuff, they munch up a lot of stuff. Why is tilling so bad when having large amounts of ground disturbance through large herbivores has maintained ecosystems over the millennia? Can you talk about that?
That's such an important question. Thank you so much for asking it. Okay, so especially when it comes to animals, so this will surprise you. When somebody comes to me and they have livestock and they want me to advise them on using compost, I end up telling them, don't waste your time applying lots of compost, leverage your livestock. If you manage livestock correctly, they're providing the right amount of disturbance and they're actually inoculating that ecosystem through their gut microbiome. So that's the amazing thing about livestock, especially ruminant animals. But you can see some amount of restoration done through monogastrics like chickens. So the beauty of livestock, if you think from a historical context, bison in North America, for instance, they, as a herd species, would graze heavily and drop manure and then move on to a fresh patch and then may not return for years. And what farmers are doing now is like mimicking that. So there's different methods of grazing called mob grazing or predator mimicry, where they're paddocking off at certain densities and reading the land to know when to move them and when to bring them back to that pasture again. And you can see extremely impressive results. There's actually, I'll go ahead and pitch this documentary that's coming out next week, Common Ground. It's the second, it was basically the sequel to Kiss the Ground. And they have an example of a ranch in a freaking desert that they returned to grassland in the Chihuahuan Desert by using livestock and nothing else. And it rains more there now because you have more. I just got chills. Whew, I just got chills. It rains there. It rains more now there because the vegetation and the evapotranspiration, the small water cycle has been restored, so it actually rains on that land more compared to the surrounding desert area. So what's cool about that too is that there's a whole what's it called? The seeds, like Lewis, I'm looking at you. There's like it's not the seed stock. What is that? Seed bank. Thank you. So there's like a whole seed bank that just exists in most of our soils, but the conditions aren't right for those plants to germinate. And so they didn't seed anything. They just managed livestock properly and got the conditions to be such that the plants came back.
All right, great questions and very detailed answers. We only have time for one more, and I'm going to do up here.
We have a question from the chat. Is the bacterial dominant compost used on large scale farms?
Oh yeah. Oh yes is the answer. I'll be succinct on that one.
Okay, that was real quick. And one more. Who else has back here? Ah, there you go. All right, here you go.
What's your take on Nite soil for compost?
That comes from like human manure. Or
Yeah.
manure.
Do you think we
Yeah.
should be using it?
Yeah, I think you can. I do have concerns about using biosludge as like a main feedstock. So that would be like, our waste goes somewhere and then it's dealt with, and then they're left with this like sludge, right? And they're trying to figure out what to do with it. They being whoever. Not me. No, and I appreciate wanting to do something with that waste stream. And I think it probably could be done. But again, with the context of where we're at now, in terms of, again, not having even the language to talk about turning that biosludge into a really useful soil amendment, I just don't have faith in the people that are marketing their biosludge-based products right now, including locally. So. And I've looked at these samples, and they're just not providing the inoculant that we really need to restore soil. But I think it could be done. I just haven't seen it done.
All right, thank you so
Thank you.
much. What a great talk.